all for being patient, and welcome to another Senior Wednesday here. You might have noticed I was gone for a while. I got married and went on a honeymoon, and now I'm back. So it's good to be back here at the museum. Thank you. And before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that next month is our Senior Wednesday holiday party at the Wichita Art Museum. So we will not have our regular program here at the museum. Don't come here because we'll be at the Wichita Art Museum next month celebrating. And also, we will be hosting a free lecture coming up this month, funded by Humanities Kansas, for our next Coffee with the Curator, and that is on November 21st at 9 a.m. Dr. Ayako Mizumura, the Academic Director of KU's Center for East Asian Studies, will be giving a presentation called Voices of Japanese War Brides in Post-War Kansas. Also, we have another program coming up with the Curator next Thursday, November 14th at 5 p.m. That one's going to be a little bit more relaxed. We have a cash bar, and 4 of our staff members and volunteers will be giving short, quick presentations that we're calling Shots of History. So if you'd like to come by November 14th at 5 p.m., that'll be a lot of fun too. Today, we are delighted to have Dr. Dave Defries, Associate Professor of History at Kansas State University.
Did I say that name right? You got it.
Sweet. He received his MA and PhD from The Ohio State University in medieval history. He also received a licentiate in medieval history from the Pontifical Institute of Medieval History in Toronto, Ontario. He was funded at the Pontifical Institute by a postdoctoral fellowship from the Mellon Foundation. He also received a Fulbright Fellowship to conduct research for a year in Belgium. His research focuses on culture and communal dynamics in early medieval Europe, circa 500 to 1100 AD. Dr. Defries began his career studying the collective identity embodied in the 11th century cult of the saints at the small Flemish abbey of Saint-Wenoc at Berg. His first book, From Citeaux to Saint-Bertin, grew out of this work. He spent 2021 to 2022 on sabbatical in Belgium, working on a book that would have approached early medieval Flanders from a global perspective. After some welcome developments, this project has evolved into a collaboration with over 20 other scholars. Currently, Brigitte Main.
Is that right?
Mainz. Brigitte Mainz, a historian at the Catholic Universiteit Leuven. Wim de Klerk, an archaeologist at the Universiteit Ghent. And he are co-editing a volume of collected essays on the evidence for global networks in early medieval Flanders to be published in 2027 with Amsterdam University Press. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Dave Defries.
Thank you. I usually like to kind of move around, but the setup here is kind of difficult, so I'll give this a shot, and if it doesn't work, I'll move out. So as you heard, I specialize in the Middle Ages, mostly right now. It's at the local and regional level, in particular on collective memory. So I'm not an expert on the Vikings. However, I'm working with experts on the Vikings and experts in military history for this new project, which includes 7 12 historians from across the world: Finland, England, Belgium, the US, the Netherlands. So it's a really nice project, and I've gotten to learn a lot about the Vikings along the way, because Flanders, where I work on, is basically the coastline of modern Belgium and on into northern France, sort of the Calais region up to the current Netherlands. That was hit very badly by the Vikings in the Middle Ages, in the period that I study. And so I'm getting to learn a lot about that as I put Flanders in the global Middle Ages. We're giving it a new context. Now, I know that for many of you, it might seem kind of strange to think about global and ages. It doesn't seem to kind of wash when you have the traditional view of the Middle Ages as a Dark Ages, sort of sealed off from the rest of the world, primitive, barbaric, backward. But in fact, what we're learning by looking at the evidence in a new way is that Flanders, the West, was connected to the rest of the known world at the time, not only through the Mediterranean, but also through the North Sea. So there were Vikings, for example, who stretched all the way around through the Strait of Gibraltar and then went all the way. Some of them made it to Baghdad in what's today Iraq. And we have evidence of this, and now that we're looking for it, we're finding it everywhere. So one of the things that we are working on as medievalists in this project of the Global Middle Ages is to take a new perspective and give a new framework for the Middle Ages. We've been fighting for a long time with this idea that the Middle Ages were backwards, dark, primitive. We know from having looked at it and having studied it that it wasn't. People were smart, people had a society that worked for them, values that worked for them. And so now what we're trying to do is to first bring light to that, and then second, my guess is that eventually we'll get rid of the Middle Ages. Now that doesn't mean I'm going to get rid of my job, it just means I'm going to study the same period, but not call it the Middle Ages. So I know that many of you might be thinking of, the depictions of the Vikings on TV and how exciting they are, and, the Blood Eagle and Ragnar Lothbrok and Ivar the Boneless. And, I thought about including a lot of that and doing that kind of thing, but, I can't compete with Hollywood. I just don't have the money or the looks. So you're going to get the scholarly impression of this. Now, so what does it mean to change a perspective on a period? For the entire modern period, we have looked at the Middle Ages predominantly in the way that the intellectuals in the Renaissance thought about the Middle Ages. They said they were breaking with their own very recent past, and they were giving birth again, renaissance, or rinascita in Italian, to the classical period, to the ancient period. And you get statues like this, where you have this comparison. There you have an ancient statue, a medieval statue or sculpture, and then a Renaissance Italian sculpture. And of course, we should hopefully recognize the Renaissance Italian one. Now, I'm going to ask you, what's missing from the ancient one? And don't think of the obvious thing. What is missing from the ancient ones? Anyone know? Keenan?
Paint.
Paint, exactly, wonderful. When these statues were unearthed, after having been buried for centuries, they were buried because the Greeks and Romans buried statues as sacred objects once they were broken. When they were unearthed, they had lost their paint. But these statues would have been painted in very gaudy colors. Things that look very different from what those Renaissance scholars thought they were doing. So they thought they were reproducing ancient culture. But little did they know that the paint had disappeared. So what they were doing was something entirely new. And in fact, they emphasized their a reconnection with the ancient world, when in fact, really what they ought to have been doing was emphasizing the continuity with the recent past. That Renaissance sculpture is a statue of David. The medieval sculpture is a statue of David and Goliath. The ancient sculpture is a statue of a pagan god. So what we have been able to do is, by discovering paint flecks on these statues, restore them. We now have microscopic methods, we can analyze their chemistry and recreate the colors. We have done something quite similar to the Vikings. From Hollywood depictions, you probably know these fearsome warriors with tattoos and dark clothing, and even though they come from Scandinavia, they are apparently half naked all the time. One wonders whether this is for Hollywood's purposes, selling these. In fact, researching the Middle Ages depictions, visual depictions, literary depictions, is that, first of all, they were scrawny. They started out as malnourished, and they had very bright clothing. In fact, medieval people knew the Scandinavians as dandies. In fact, sometimes they said, "Oh, hide your women. The Scandinavians are coming. We don't want them to, lure away our women." So, how do we get there? How do we get from the thing on the right to the thing on the left? Well, the first is part of that perspective. part of that framework that was built around the Middle Ages. And that is to think of them as savages. And in fact, to think of everyone in the Middle Ages as savages. This is a concept that primarily dates back to the era of the Europeans colonizing the Americas. Europeans in the 1600s came into contact with Native Americans. And the first thing they said was, oh my gosh, because they had no context to understand who these people were. None of their ancient authorities talked about this. The Bible didn't talk about it. And so they began to really question the authorities about the world. In addition, the Native Americans themselves were no slouches. We have records of 4-hour debates between Native Americans and Europeans, in which the Native Americans said to the colonizers, how can you live like you do? You have too many poor people. How can you live under a monarch? We would never do this. We would never allow ourselves to live in that sort of a society. And some of them observed it firsthand. They went to Europe and observed it. And we have records of them. Well, of course, this threw the Europeans for a loop. They thought of themselves as superior. And so they created a category, they created a whole history for themselves of progress. The human race advances through certain stages and progresses to superior stages, to superior societies, and in fact, civilization. They looked at the Native Americans as savages, people who lived in the wild. That comes from French. So they looked at the Native Americans as living in the wild, living close to nature. And of course, that justified the expropriation of their land, because you could make private property and make it superior than what the Native Americans were using. Well, it was not a very far jump or leap to go to characterizing the Middle Ages, this backward, primitive period, as savage, as barbaric. They had already had this idea coming out of the Renaissance, the rejection of that culture of the Middle Ages. And boy, were the Vikings the extreme example of the savages in the Middle Ages. Now, the Europeans in the 1600s, 1700s didn't just make this up. In the medieval sources, there are reports about the Vikings. Oh, they're rapacious wolves. They come in and steal everything and kill everybody willy-nilly, and they're, irrational, and they're just violent. So it's not like they made it up, but this idea of the savage persists, and we get it in our culture. That's why those Vikings appear very violent in our literature, in our videos, in our Hollywood entertainment, because of this framework that has been placed on the Middle Ages, and then the Vikings as sort of the extreme example of that. This then colors our entire perception, traditional perception, of what was happening with the Vikings, how they were affecting European society. Because they basically show up and ravage the landscape. So this ties in with the traditional idea of what medieval warfare was like. Okay, according to Enlightenment historians like Edward Gibbon, who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 1776, and we're still talking about his framework. We still talk about decline and falls of empires. According to Gibbon, he said there were two factors that caused the decline and fall of Rome. The first was Christianity. Christianity caused the Romans to lose their warlike spirit. It was too pacifist. Okay, this is the Enlightenment. He's rejected the medieval, he's rejected religion, he's rejected Christianity. So Christianity was the problem. Never mind that the Christians had no problem going to war, no problem fighting each other for that matter. So he said, Rome's morals were weakened. Its civilization declined. And then it fell when these primitive Germanic barbarians marched into the Roman Empire and ended the government. And you get maps like this up on in the narratives. Well, historians working off of this idea of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire into barbarity then read the sources from the Middle Ages that talked about warfare. And these were romantic sources. They talked about knights on horseback. And they talked about a few people, because they were focusing on the elite. They talked about a few people fighting on horseback and doing, things with swords and spears. And, not terrible, not the picture you would expect from, say, looking at the Roman Empire, where you had armies of 20,000 men with information, with, how many people have seen the phalanxes in Greek hands? Good, okay. Phalanx comes from the word phalanges, the Greek word phalanges. It's because that's what the spears look like when they come out behind, out of the shield wall, right? To make that work, you have to drill. You have to have a professional army. And when historians read the sources from the Middle Ages, they didn't see a professional army. They saw knights on horseback, running around the countryside, looting, pillaging, and they assumed that these people had no logistics, no supply lines, and instead just let their horses feed as they went along and ate whatever they could steal from the peasants in their path, and then stole the silver and gold from them. Well, that assumption was based on a comparison to the Plains Indians, because both the Middle Ages and the Native Americans were savages. And the Plains Indians fought on horseback in small bands and didn't have big formations. So therefore, the medieval people, that's what they did as well. Of course, the assumption here is also that the fall of the Roman Empire led to massive depopulation in Western Europe. You don't have big armies because you don't have very many people. The cities are decaying, there's nobody in them. It's ruin, it's waste, it's destruction, it's chaos. And this is all based on this framework, based on an assumption about who modern people were, about what they had done in the Enlightenment. And so they cast that framework back over top of the sources. The people I'm working with, people like David Bachrach, who's a military historian, are currently revising this image, revising this framework. Currently, the tradition of the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages with warfare on horseback amongst a few people still persists today. There are people, there are historians who very unadvisedly defend that position. The people I'm working with are revising it to emphasize continuity. The first thing they point out is that the depopulation we see at the end of the Roman Empire was not related to culture, was not related to the Germanic barbarians' barbarism. These were people who had been in contact with the Roman Empire for 200 or 300 years. Many of them had been drafted into the Roman army or had enlisted into the Roman army. Many of them had settled inside the boundaries of the Roman Empire. The five-star general, the last five-star general of the West in the Roman Empire was a Germanic barbarian. He was a Vandal, the people who give us the name vandalism. So these people were not the sort of standard fur-wearing barbarians that we get the image of, these savages. The second thing that people like Bachrach point out is that there's a big difference between the American plains and Western Europe. Just take a minute to think about this. Western Europe had fortified Roman cities, cities with big walls around them. They also had fortresses. And during the Middle Ages, we know from new archaeological excavations that they built hundreds of them. So when they conquered a territory, they would plant fortresses all along the rivers, which is how you transport your military, your armies, by boat usually. Because in that case, there's no Roman road there. These fortresses and the maintenance of the fortified cities took tens of thousands of labor hours, man hours. And they did them sometimes in a year or two. They built these fortresses very quickly. So we're talking, 20-foot high walls, 6-foot wide walls on these fortresses and cities. This means that the primary form of warfare was not men on horseback, it was siege warfare, because that makes the most sense. In the Middle Ages, if you're a commander, I don't know how it is today, but if you're a commander, you don't want a battle, because you might lose. So you don't want a pitched battle where your troops might might get scared and break formation. You don't want that. So you try siege warfare as much as possible. You avoid the battles, and furthermore, we know now from looking at the sources again, looking at sort of legal sources more intensely, that most of the battles and the backbone of the military were the infantry. It was the elite who rode to battle. And as usual, they're the ones who talk about themselves, right? It's always the generals who win the wars, right? Alexander the Great conquered Persia. Had nothing to do with the tens of thousands of soldiers behind him, but So our romantic sources, our narrative sources are all about the elites. Even they, however, rode to battle on a horse and then hopped off and served as heavy infantry in their more expensive armor. The only time you get on a horse in a battle is if you're trying to flank the infantry. If you're trying to get around them fast so you can break their formation, or better yet, when they run, then you can run them down and stab them in the back, because that's what you do as an elite on a horse. And then you can steal their armor and you get the spoils of war. So the primary form of warfare was siege warfare. That means that you have to have a big army. It takes a lot of men to surround a fortress and cut off supplies. That means basically the armies were probably about the size of the armies that the Roman military could muster. At their biggest, 20,000 men. Now, to get a man to a battle and keep him fighting, to march and then fight, it takes a lot of calories. David Bachrach and his father Bernie have estimated conservatively 3,600 calories per day. Okay, that equals about 5 pounds of food per day. You can cut it up different ways. Meat has more calories than bread, or you can have beer, wine. Red wine is really good in terms of calories, as any of you who know about the growing stomach, from drinking wine. So you can cut up different ways. 1,000 soldiers require 5 tons of food per day. There have been modern experiments in which just civilians, not terribly fit soldiers, have carried 100-pound packs, full of food for 250 miles on marches. That's pretty good. And that 100 pounds of food would last you for about 17 days. But then, most of these marches, especially the ones that were expeditions into new territory, were longer than 17 days. It took longer than that. You can maybe get 15, 20 miles a day consistently on a march. That means that they had to have mules or other form of animate labor if they were marching along a road, or better yet, if they were marching along a river, which is what they usually tried to do, you put them in boats, because boats are much more efficient than land transport. In fact, in the ancient world, it was cheaper to transport grain from Alexandria to Rome, 1,500 kilometers, than it was to transport it 50 miles inland. Okay, it gives you some idea of the scope. What this means is medieval governments were sophisticated. They had logistics. Once you look at the sources, people like, if you've ever heard of Charlemagne, Charles the Great, the Carolingian ruler, he issued standards he told the estates that were his estates, the royal estates, that were scattered throughout his kingdom, that they had to produce wagons to a certain standard. They were all standardized, and they all had to be watertight, because you would have to ford rivers with these wagons with the food inside, and you didn't want the water to get to the food because it would spoil. Then there's no point. So we're talking about really sophisticated operations here. They would plan, they would stockpile food, they would plan where they were going to attack in the next year, and they would stockpile food along the way in various fortresses. So they had planning. They were not dumb people. They were not primitive barbarians. So we've reversed our understanding of who these mainly Frankish, or we call them the sort of proto-French, were, not barbarians. The Vikings, on the other hand, have suffered in the opposite direction, because what we realize is that they were not very good warriors. Take a look at that map there for a second. It's a topographical map. That's Scandinavia. There's not a lot of green there, because most of Scandinavia is rocky mountains. And that means they don't grow a lot of grain. So quite on top of having not a very good climate for growing a lot of food, they don't have a lot of land to grow a lot of food. And that means when we look at the skeletons of some of these early Vikings, they're malnourished, they're short, they're not imposing. They're nothing like those beefy hunks, who have been raised on protein drinks in the movies. So what does that mean? Well, the first thing that it means is that we realize that Viking is not an ethnic name. It's not an ethnic term. It got turned into an ethnic term for Scandinavians in the 19th century, right after the Enlightenment, when they were thinking of them as all being barbarians, violent warriors. Instead, Viking, which appears both in Old English and in Old Icelandic, means pirate. And what do pirates do? They raid when there's no army around. So these warriors who were so fierce, supposedly, they're waiting for the army, the big imposing army with logistics and formations and supply lines that can mount sieges, to go away, so that they can then steal stuff, including people, including silver, including gold, and they can eat the food that's stockpiled in different places. Now, it's also key that they're not raiding the fortresses when the armies are away, because they don't have siege equipment. They don't have trebuchets. They have none of the complicated machinery that will knock down walls. So they have to go after. Oh, and by the way, the actual terms in the medieval sources for these people are actually Danes or Northmen or Dacians, so the people from the north. These Vikings steal from monasteries and churches, because the monasteries and churches had not been attacked before. In Christian Europe, you don't usually, there are some cases, but you don't usually attack a church. You don't usually attack a monastery, a holy site. That didn't matter to the Vikings. They weren't Christian. So they thought they'd hit the bonanza. They would come in, these monasteries were wealthy, lots of gold and silver that donated to them to hold the religious services, the mass in their churches, lots of ornate decorations. They had stockpiles of food because they were wealthy institutions. They had peasants working for them. Most of the monks were elites. Most of the monks had come from the nobility and were used to a certain way of life. So every year after the harvest, the monasteries would stockpile their grain, and then the Vikings would choose which one they were going to raid. They would come in, steal people, and if they found a noble person or a wealthy person, they would try to ransom them. Yeah. It's a lot easier to carry gold and silver than it is to carry a person. The peasants they would take and sell somewhere else as slaves. Then they would take the gold and silver, they might melt some of it down and make what's called hacked silver out of it. That's where you always see those armbands of silver on the Vikings. That's their bank. They're carrying their wealth that they've looted on their arms. And then when they want to pay for something, they hack it up. They hack the silver up and pay for food or weapons or whatever. Well, so this leads to a question. First question is, how'd they know where to raid? How'd they know when the army was missing? Where did they get this information if they were just raiding and pillaging and they were irrational wolves and beasts? Where did they get this information? Well, we know that for several centuries, at least from the 600s, there were trading ports. And Scandinavians were trading with people on the continent. So you can see the network here. The ones in yellow are trading ports set up by sort of the Proto-Germans or Proto-French. They're called emporia. And then you can see Bergen and Kaupang and Birka and Ribe and Hythabu in Denmark and the rest of Scandinavia. They were trading. And interestingly enough, as everybody knew, traders are also spies. And that's why you really want to control the merchants who are going through your territory. So they had all sorts of rules about where the merchants were allowed to go and what they were allowed to see, because they knew that those merchants were collecting information, and they would then take back and tell the warriors, this monastery, it's big. Oh my God, we saw so much silver. Go get that. Okay? So we see this trading. They made it down to Marseille. This trading network went to Marseille and even to Rome. There was actually, the Frisians are a group of people in the current Netherlands. There was actually a specific neighborhood set up in Rome just for Frisians to live in. So we know these people were moving all over. Interestingly enough, you see those dots? Those are the emporia, the trading ports. The shaded areas, that's where the Vikings hit. They're hitting the same river valleys that they were trading in. They're trading for things like this. This is Merovingian jewelry and a Merovingian claw beaker. These are sort of a vase. These were created in that area in orange down at the bottom and found in Denmark in the 7th century, in the 600s. Coins, gold coins minted down there in Dorestad, where the yellow dot is, found at Jelling and Kaupang up in Scandinavia. Imitations of the gold made in different places, also found up in Scandinavia. Here's some of the pottery that they're trading. Made down, it's called Badorf ware, made down in the south there on the continent, found up throughout Scandinavia. These are the sites where this pottery was found. These are some rather nicer pottery, more decorative, a little bit more expensive, also made in the sort of Rhineland region of what's today Germany, also found up as far up north as Birka, that up there where the orange dot is. This is sort of less glamorous trade, but this is a trade in the thing on the bottom right there is a quernstone. It's a lava rock that you carve and then you use it to grind things. These were exported from the Rhineland all throughout the North Sea world. And we find them and we know that they're from the Rhineland because of their mineral composition. And so we find them up in Scandinavia. So they have intimate contact with this world. And I just passed by this. And we have some of these coins that were actually minted in Denmark, found all the way down in Marseille, in southern France. So we have a sense of what they're doing. They're trading all over the place. It's fairly high volume. It's not just elite goods or expensive goods, luxury goods. It's also things like the Vikings or the Scandinavians don't have great things to trade. They're not known for their pottery. They're not known for their jewelry. They're known for things like amber that they've gotten from the Baltic region, timber, so more sort of raw materials that they're trading down onto the continent. Well, that leads to another question. So we've covered how do they know where to hit, when to hit. But we know that they were trading for a couple centuries before the Viking Age started in the late 700s. So why did it only start in the late 700s? Well, part of the answer is they discovered how to make ships better. Their ship technology got better, it improved. So they began what's called clinker construction, which is basically, the siding on your house is clinker construction. Overlapping boards that are nailed together. Now, the first thing about the clinker construction is that it's really flexible. So it can handle rough seas like the North Sea, the things that these Vikings were sailing on. But the other thing they did was they made these ships with very shallow drafts. You see that hull? It doesn't go down very far. And what that means is that not only can they sail on the sea, but they can then sail up rivers. And the continental navies can't do that. Their drafts are a lot deeper. They can't navigate those rivers. So these Viking pirates who don't want to meet the opposing military, who want to get in and out, can do that. They can sail right up the river, hit, and then leave. Personally, I would not want to be on one of these ships in a storm. I mean, that's just not enough ship for me. I'm a sort of landlubber, I guess. But so that's part of the reason. Another part of the reason is the political situation under the Frankish Germanic barbarians under the dynasty of the Carolingians. And that's Charlemagne, Charles the Great, or, well, the Germans would call him Karl the Große, but we've adopted the French Charlemagne, Charles the Great. He started with a Frankish kingdom that was in that green area there. And then he conquered those blue areas and then subjugated the orange areas to himself with his sophisticated army. This is the guy who was mandating that the wagons be built to exact standards, okay? So he created this really big empire that was strong, had big armies, 20,000 men at a shot, he could muster. The Vikings began to hit in the very beginning of his kingdom, but they only hit the coastline. They didn't go very far. And so Charlemagne responded by doing exactly what the Romans had done, because the Romans had dealt with pirates from the North Sea as well. And he organized the whole coastline, including cooperating with the English, to create what's called the Litus Saxonicum, the Saxon shore. There's a set of towers and fortresses. And then he also built a navy. And we know this because he visited the navy at Boulogne, which is sort of right up here in Flanders, which I studied. He visited the navy at Boulogne and inspected it. It wasn't very effective. Cut to the chase there. It wasn't very effective against these fast-moving Viking pirate ships. However, his son ran into some problems. His son was named Louis the Pious. And Charlemagne's grandsons were kind of itchy to take over the kingdom. So they deposed their father. And they divided up the kingdom, and then they started fighting with each other. So what happens is we get political turmoil in the 830s in this Carolingian kingdom, and that's exactly when the Vikings started hitting harder and moving inland. And they would even overwinter, meaning they would come into the rivers, stay long enough, eat the food, have a good time, and then say, we're going to spend the winter here, where they would hole up in a monastery and enjoy the food, the wine, the beer, and repair their ships. So they would overwinter, and the political chaos that was going on as these various Frankish armies, again, the big Frankish armies, logistics, supply lines, were fighting each other. That gave these pirates a chance to sneak in. So one of the things that comes up logically as a result of thinking about this overwintering and thinking about these Vikings repairing their ships is, where did they get the materials? there was some materials in the monasteries that they were holed up in. Or they might set up a camp on an island, which the Franks couldn't, get to. Their ships wouldn't get to. But where'd they get the materials? Well, what we now see is that these guys were the consummate opportunists. They would trade in one place and raid in another. And in fact, they would hit one monastery in one region and then go to the next region over and sell the silver, or use the silver to buy stuff. Or sell the slaves. And so when they made these camps, they actually set up, sort of production. We know, we can identify many of these camps because they have the nails that they use to repair their ships. They, fall out. They're forging them, and they fall out and they're all over the ground. And so when we do archaeological excavations, they needed hardwood, really good to have oak, which the continent had in relative abundance at the time. In the 11th century, most of the oak forests were clear-cut, but in the Carolingian period, the 9th and 10th century, there were still forests that they could repair their ships with, repair the damage that the sea had done and the weather had done. So they're setting up trading with the continental population, not irrational, not just willy-nilly doing violence. And we know that the Vikings were also going eastward. The traditional story focuses on the west, on them hitting the places we call France and Germany. They made it all the way to Constantinople. This is the shaded areas are where they got to. In the east, they found a very different situation. The governments were stronger, more stable, and it was harder to go up the rivers. You often had to portage your boats. You had to take them out of the water and carry them. So you had to have smaller boats, and it was harder to pillage. And in fact, some of them settled down. The Rus, the ancestors of the Russians. Rus is probably from a Scandinavian word meaning to row. These were the pirates, the Vikings, who a dynasty took control of what's today Kiev and Novgorod in sort of Ukraine and spread into Russia. So they settled down, trading and raiding where it was opportune. So there's the Rus. Now, in the West, they quickly adopted a strategy to just pay these guys off. A guy by the name of one of Charlemagne's grandsons named Charles the Bald tried to build some fortified bridges over the rivers to stop them and he garrisoned them. It wasn't very effective. And he found it's much more effective just take a boatload of silver, or a cartload of silver and give it to them and say, go away. And they did, but then of course they came back the next year, which made Charles's subjects rather upset, especially his nobles who were often footing the bill. Well, it's not that far to go from paying these guys tribute to go away to paying these guys money to become mercenaries. And this is exactly what they did. They hired them to protect the shore, the coast, from other pirates. The most famous of these were the Varangian Guard, the mercenaries that protected the Byzantine Emperor. They were down in Constantinople, what's today Istanbul. And in fact, one of these guys scratched his name into the marble of Hagia Sophia, the great imperial church in Istanbul. His name is Halfdan. He might have been the same guy who took his earnings from being basically a general in the Byzantine service and went back up to the Rus, back up to Kiev, and set himself up as a prince. So both sides are opportunists. Both sides are being very practical. Eventually, they stopped paying them and they just gave them some land. So for example, a guy by the name of Hofer, or Rollo, in 911 was given a chunk of land at Rouen in northern France, and he and his descendants then expanded that territory to become the Duchy of Normandy, the Duchy of the Normans, the Northmen. They then went on to conquer England in the Norman conquest from William the Conqueror in 1066, which is traditionally seen as the end of the Viking Age, because then he sets up this big government. Even before that, in the end of the 9th century, there was what was called the Great Heathen Army that attacked England, and eventually one of the leaders of that army they were defeated and most of them were dispersed, but one of the leaders named Guthrum said to Alfred the Great of Wessex, I'll convert to Christianity and you let me live here. And they set up what's called the Danelaw, the place where Danish law is applied. And there were Vikings or Scandinavians in charge of that orange chunk, a huge chunk of England. Now, during the Viking period, they got around. This is from Helgo in, this finding here was from Helgo in modern Sweden. So on an island in a lake in modern Sweden, and so on the east coast. There is an Irish crozier, that's the top of a bishop's staff, okay, from the 700s. There's a Coptic ladle, that's from Egypt. And then there's a Buddha from Kashmir, from the 500s. So eventually, over a couple hundred years, these things made it to Sweden. There's the Buddha. The Swedes have made a postage stamp out of this. It's on one of their official postage stamps. That's where they found it, in 1954, all the way up there. If you are interested in this topic, this is the book I recommend you start with, Kat Jarman's River Canes. She went back and looked at the findings, the archaeological findings, from this site called Repton, where another part in England, where another part of the great heathen army sort of set up a camp. And there's a mass grave there. And basically, she's found the new flecks of paint. We have DNA. Teeth have hard enamel, and they protect the pulp over long periods of time. So you can often, or well, sometimes extract DNA from the pulp. And so we weren't sure whose bones these were. They could have been the monks whose cemetery the Vikings had set up shop in. But in fact, these are Scandinavian bones. And many of them show signs of injury. So we think that this is from a battle that was fought nearby in 873. This is what Jarman has used as the sort of MacGuffin, or the sort of tool to propel you through. It's a carnelian bead. There's only one place in the world that this comes from, Gujarat in India. So during the Viking Age, a bead, a carnelian bead, with a little hole through it to make it into jewelry, made it from the west coast of India all the way up to England. Now, that doesn't explode the myths about the Dark Ages. I don't know what will. And so eventually, I suspect that finds like this will begin to dispel that periodization of the Middle Ages. We're going to have to come up with something new, because there's just too much continuity going even from the 9th century or the late 8th century all the way into the 1500s in terms of mobility, moving around. There's just too much to say that there's a fundamental difference between the modern and the medieval. Thank you. I'll take any questions you might have.
I have a microphone for if anybody has a question. I'll hold it up so you can hear me. Just over here. Let me make sure the volume is up on this first. Check, check, check. Check, 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 check. Okay, it's on.
Doesn't one of the Varangian leaders go back to Norway?
The ranking what leaders?
One of the Varangian Guard leaders go back to Norway?
Yeah, there's, we know from some rune stones. Well, we know that some of the sons come back and they set up rune stones to their father, which say, this is in commemoration. You don't make, I'm sorry, you don't make big, long texts on stones. It's hard to carve, right? And so it says things like, Rolf set this up for Ivar, his son or his father, who died in the East, right? And so we know some of these people made it back. And we know some of these Varangian guards made it back, so yes. But I don't know specifically which one you're
I
talking about.
can't remember the guy's name. I read the Cornwell series about the Vikings, getting into that. And he changes stuff around, and he always put into the books, and this is what actually happened. And all these places existed, some of this stuff happened, I've got it out of place or out of time, but it's all true.
Yeah, I mean, we have evidence for these guys going back, because they didn't really want to stay in the East forever. They really wanted to go back and purchase a farm or some land back in Scandinavia and set themselves up as a, buy a couple of slaves and so forth.
One thing Cornwell brings up in his books, he's back looking for lands. He went over the Danes and the rest of them, and they was set up and they was homesteading, and they were looking for land.
Oh yeah, in fact, so another theory about why they're moving out at the particular point is that the idea is that Scandinavia gets overpopulated. But it's very difficult to sort of prove that. We don't really have the sort of physical evidence to prove it. But we do have, one of the theories now is not that they're all going back, because there's just not a whole lot of land. A lot of them want to set up shop on the continent, or one of the ideas now is that they formed what are called hydrarchies, so monarchies on the water. And so you have these formations of sort of like little clan war bands that then band together in bigger confederations to do things. And then they move back, they move around, and if you're moving around and you're stealing stuff, you can go buy all the food you need, right? You can go land, buy food, and then you don't need land. You're essentially stealing other people's farm goods.
Any other questions?
Did the Vikings actually make it to Oklahoma? Ever? Vikings.
Oh, yeah, no, they didn't make it that far. They made it to Newfoundland. And we know we have there's an archaeological excavation of the sort of longhouse that they did there. They didn't last long because the native people there, Inuit, used to be called Eskimo, so they got rid of them pretty quickly and forced them out. They never made it into a place that stone that was set up in Oklahoma was or is it Minnesota? It was Minnesota, yeah, that was a hoax basically. Wishful thinking. Great.
But there are priests that, they were pilfering, churches, places like that. Did that, obviously, since the diet was better, did that assist them with maybe going a little further into Greenland, places like that, or?
Well, Greenland is a really hard place to live. You build your houses out of sod if you can, and you use driftwood for doors. So, there were two settlements in Greenland, one in the east, one in the west. And the one in the west just disappears. Nobody knows what happened to it. They visited it later and it was empty, it's gone. Greenland's a really difficult place to live in. Mostly what they're doing in Greenland is catching walruses, because walrus hide makes really good rope for the sails, and of course the ivory can be made into jewelry and drinking horns and things like that. But yeah, they're there to harvest sort of the sea riches there, and eventually, they get a bishop. But the bishop usually spends his time in Iceland because it's not really great to live there, and he visits and then he goes 1 year and then he comes back, several years later, and they're all gone. So we don't know what happened. But they did pick up continental fighting. One of the prerequisites for actually holding territory on the continent, like Normandy, is that they adapted. They adopted the techniques of these richer people eventually, and especially once they got better land, then they adopted formations and logistical lines and things like that, and they basically assimilated.
I've got a question for you.
Sure.
So I've heard that when the Vikings came to England, the locals were shocked at how often they bathed and how clean they were. Is that true?
Yeah, so we've got, how many people have seen The 13th Warrior? Okay, one person, two people. Okay, three. So we have a report by a Muslim, Ibn Fadlan, about the Vikings, who was appalled, you know, and in the movie it shows them, you know, spitting into the same bowl and then washing their faces and hands with it, and so there are some customs, we're not really sure, you know, we're talking about a Muslim, an Arab from a refined court setting who maybe wanted to make them appear worse. He shows a whole death ritual where, you know, there's a gang rape of a slave woman that then gets killed with the Lord. So maybe he was making it so that his audience would be appalled. On the other hand, we have reports, like I said, you know, that they wore bright clothing and they bathed, and yes, so we have mixed evidence. My guess, I mean, medieval people bathed. They knew that you get sick if you get dirty, and in fact, sometimes they diverted whole rivers into their streets to wash away the manure, because the biggest problem when you have animals as your main source of labor is that they produce tons of manure. And it sits in the street. If you don't, you know, they would often pile it up and then use it for the fields. But they were clean. But the Vikings are known for being, like I said, sort of dandy. They really cared about their clothing. They really had bright colors. They had jewelry, you know, and you know, they would have caps with little silver points on them. It's one of the things that we know that they were around when they have these little silver cap points on them. So it seems like they were clean, but not necessarily in contrast to your average medieval person, if that makes sense.
Any other questions? It's hard for me to see around these pillars, making sure I don't miss anyone.
I think that's it.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Defries, for your time.
My pleasure.